Nuggets. It's me, Carl. Hey, as Christians, we often find ourselves quoting some of our favorite verses. Some like Philippians 4:13, John 3:16. One of my personal favorites, Proverbs 27, verse 14. Don't talk to me till I've had my morning coffee, you know what I'm saying? It's humor. But then, there are some who like to quote Bible verses that, just like my desire to explore infinitely dark and mysterious caves, it doesn't exist. So I present to you my all-time favorite Bible verses that are not in the Bible. God works in mysterious ways. He does. Cleanliness is next to godliness. Yes. Pride comes before the fall. Yikes. It's nice to be important, but more important, to be nice. Smile. If you take one step, God will take two. Does that make sense? If He closes one door, He'll open a window. Let go and let God. Just do it. That's Nike. You're a wizard, Harry, and you're a hairy wizard, Hagrid. This too shall pass. Follow your heart.
This has been our favorite Bible verses that aren't actually in the Bible with Cool Carl. Thanks for stopping by.
Hey, good morning, everyone. If you're ever wondering what it's like at youth group, Cool Carl kind of like embodies that a lot. I get major youth pastor vibes off of that guy. But welcome to everyone. If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Peter, and I'm the youth pastor here at the Meeting Place Church. And wherever you're streaming from today, we're really excited to have a chance to spend some time with you this morning. So today, we're continuing our series called That's from the Bible. And, well, we just heard a bunch of verses that aren't actually in the Bible. Like, believe it or not, Harry Potter appears nowhere in the Bible. Surprising? I know, but it's true. But in this series, we've been looking at a lot of common phrases or sayings that pop up in daily life that maybe surprisingly find their origins in the Bible. They actually are from the Bible. Phrases like scapegoat, or the 11th hour, or a wolf in sheep's clothing. And the one that we're going to be exploring today that most of us have probably heard at some point or have even said at some point, go the extra mile, which is usually said to mean something like do more than is expected of you, give your best, persevere, especially when you're working on something difficult. And it would just be really easy to cut corners and finish quickly, which is how I understood it when I was in high school, particularly when I was doing math homework. And all I wanted to do was cut corners by flipping to the end of the math book where they had conveniently placed all the answers. Ugh, it was incredible. And it was in those moments of my mathematical dilemma that the phrase, go the extra mile, would come to mind. And if you've seen Star Wars, where Obi-Wan says, use the Force, Luke. Maybe it's kind of like that. Go the extra mile, Peter. And I would feel this need to overcome my laziness, to do more than was expected of me, and to persevere. And sometimes I would. And sometimes, maybe more often, I wouldn't. Which were the times I realized that I probably should have gone the extra mile because my teacher could tell when I used the answers in the back of the book. And she marked accordingly. So that didn't quite work out too well. But is that all this go the extra mile phrase is about? Is it just about persevering through laziness, not cutting corners, doing more than is expected of you when it comes to working on things? Well, as we take some time to explore this age-old saying in its original context, what we'll find is that it is actually so much more than an antidote for laziness. It's actually an invitation into something that is bigger than ourselves. Go the extra mile. It's originally from a section of Jesus' teaching that we talk about a lot here at the Meeting Place Church called the Sermon on the Mount. And the reason we talk about this so much is because this is kind of like one of Jesus' flagship teachings. The sermon followed after a period of time where Jesus spent his time traveling through the land of Judea, teaching about the kingdom of God and performing miracles, which got people's attention as they began to realize that there was something special about Jesus. And so more and more people began traveling to see him teach, to see him work, and many of them had traveled days-long journeys just to come see him. And eventually, so many people had traveled to see Jesus that the crowds were huge. But not only had Jesus attracted the attention of ordinary people, he also drew the attention of leaders from various Jewish religious groups who were there to kind of scope out this situation. Why were so many people interested in this Jesus guy? And they were kind of wondering, what is this Jesus guy all about? So during Jesus' time, one of the most prevalent Jewish religious groups was known as the Pharisees, whose relationship with Jesus was strained, to put it mildly. This is because the Pharisees, along with the Jewish people, believed and followed a long list of commandments for life called the Law of Moses, or simply the Law. And so for them, the law was sacred, as they had received it from God through one of their most important historical leaders, a guy named Moses. And the law became the cornerstone that the Jewish people built their nation on, built their religious systems on, and individually built their lives on. And not only that, but they believed that it was by following the law that they, as the Jewish people, were made right in their relationship with God, the way that they believed they were put into right standing with God. And it's how they saw that their identity, how they differentiated themselves from all the other nations around them. They were God's chosen people, and they lived this out by following the law. And so the Pharisees, this group of religious leaders, they saw it as their purpose to follow and enforce the law perfectly, mainly by making rules about how to follow the rules and then going around scolding and canceling people for breaking the rules about the rules. Like this one time where the Pharisees got mad at Jesus because him and his disciples were hungry. And as they were walking through this grain field, they were plucking the heads off the grain and eating them. And this day just happened to be the Sabbath day of rest. And so the Pharisees got mad because one of the rules in the law was to keep the Sabbath day special, set it aside, and don't do any work on it. And harvesting was work. And as Jesus and his disciples were walking through this grain field, plucking heads of grain, well, that was pretty close to harvesting. So therefore, in the Pharisees' minds, Jesus and his disciples were working on the Sabbath day, and they'd broken the law. Like, come on, man. Seriously, follow the rules about the rules. So when it came to following the law, religiously, you could say that the Pharisees went the extra mile, maybe a few miles too far, focusing purely on externally focused behavior. And so the law was a big deal for the Pharisees and for the Jewish people. And to mess with the interpretation of the law that the religious leaders were teaching, that a lot of people held to, well, to mess with that interpretation, like the rules about the rules, that would start to venture into this sort of blasphemy kind of area, which was another no-no. And it could actually get you killed, which, spoiler alert, the Pharisees killed Jesus because they thought he was blaspheming. But you should read this story anyway. It's awesome because it ends well. So, yeah, the law was a big deal. And so these Pharisees, they were in attendance when Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount. And so it was with kind of a sense of anticipation and tension in the air with the common people there kind of looking for hope, looking to Jesus for something new, something hopeful. And with these handfuls of religious leaders also in attendance, on edge about what Jesus would say next, we read that Jesus went up on a mountainside, he sat down, and his disciples gathered around him, and he began to teach them. And what followed was the Sermon on the Mount, a teaching jam-packed with images, metaphors, and mind-blowing claims about what God and his kingdom were all about and how people could actually be a part of that kingdom. And as Jesus taught, he started talking about the law. He started getting into some touchy subjects. And Jesus said this, "Don't misunderstand why I have come. I didn't come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I've come to accomplish their purpose. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not even the smallest detail of God's law will disappear until its purpose is achieved. So if you ignore the least commandment and teach others to do the same, you will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But anyone who obeys God's law and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." And I can imagine the religious leaders hearing Jesus say this and think like, okay, so far so good. We're with you. The law is important. It should be followed. And then Jesus drops this on them. He says, "But I warn you, unless your righteousness is better than the righteousness of the teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." I can imagine the Pharisees, wait, what? We're not good enough either? According to Jesus, no one, not even the rule-following best of the best, were good enough to fulfill the law's purpose. So you can imagine that the Pharisees were probably pretty rattled at this point. But what was happening here, and this is something that I love about Jesus, is that he was so smart in the way that he taught. And here we see him setting up his listeners to have their previous understandings of God and his ways flipped right on their heads. Specifically, he was setting them up to see their sacred law in a way that they'd maybe never seen it, centered around its true purpose. So Jesus begins tackling specific commands about murder, about idolatry, about divorce, about vows. And with each commandment, he sheds light on what it looks like to truly fulfill the law. And with each law Jesus tackles, I imagine some in the crowd experiencing freedom, experiencing joy, while others, the Pharisees, experiencing a growing frustration and annoyance with Jesus. And then Jesus comes to this portion of the law that talks about proportional punishment. And he says this. He says, "You have heard the law that says the punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. If you are sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles. Give to those who ask, and don't turn away from those who want to borrow." And it's here that we find the origin of go the extra mile. What we typically say to mean, make sure you work really hard, don't cut corners, go further than expected. But is work in this context all Jesus is talking about? Like, what is he really getting at here? So to help us understand what Jesus is saying, we need to know that this eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth saying, this was a really primitive justice system in ancient times. And it kind of served its purpose. And it was instituted in order to limit the amount of damage that was done to a person as punishment for the wrong that they'd done to another individual. It was kind of to make sure that if someone did something like kill their neighbor's sheep, that neighbor didn't just come and kill that person. Instead, their punishment would be proportional to their wrong. So instead of a life for a sheep, it was a sheep for a sheep. But what ended up happening was that people became so quick to take judicial revenge on each other, pushing the law to its fullest extent while being careful not to overstep the limitations of the law. Their hearts were cold towards their neighbors, and they were only concerned about getting what was legally theirs. And for Jesus, this missed the whole point of the law. On another occasion, when Jesus was asked about the law, about how to fulfill it, he said, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself." The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. So for Jesus, the whole purpose of the law was to help people learn to love. It was not simply a list of do's and don'ts that were given to people for rigid behavior modification, for purely external changes in behavior. Which is why when Jesus responded to the law of an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, he responded with examples of a radical new way of understanding it, one that reflects what it looks like to fulfill the law with love. So as his Jewish listeners would have heard it, this is sort of in their context what they would have been thinking when Jesus was saying this. If you're insulted by a backhand, if someone slaps you, if you're insulted with a backhand across the face, instead of looking to smack the other person back as quickly and as hard as legally allowed, forego your legal right and respond by turning the other cheek. If you are sued for your less valuable shirt, instead of giving the bare minimum, forego the legal limits and offer your more valuable cloak as well. If a Roman soldier, an enforcer of an occupying government in the Jewish lands, exercises their legal right to commandeer you and make you carry their gear 1,000 paces, forego those legal limits. And out of love for them as a person, go 2,000 paces. If someone asks you to borrow money, instead of holding on to all that is legally yours, out of love, let go and be generous. And so for Jesus, these examples were not just another set of more loving laws that get us back to the problem of simple external behaviors. Instead, they were examples of what it could look like for people to fulfill the true purpose of the law. Loving others out of their love for God. So in this context, what Jesus was getting at is that going the extra mile means instead of doing the bare minimum to fulfill your legal requirements of love or Jesus' command of love to another person, instead, let go of your legal rights and go beyond your obligations in order to show honor and love to another person. Or simply, while the law limits, love lavishes. So you know who one of my favorite people in the world is? My wife, Emily. And I know she's watching right now, and I know there's a big smile on her face. Seriously, she is thebomb.com. And here is one of the reasons why. For a while, we had this little chore chart at our house. I say for a while because we we should probably use it again. It was really nice. But we had this chore chart for a little while at our house, and it kind of just helped us stay on top of all the little cleaning things that need to happen around the house that often get forgotten until it's too late, and it's just like really gross. Those things like cleaning the toilet, changing the bedding, vacuuming, all that kind of fun stuff. So how it would work is that each of us would write our name beside the different chores that we would be responsible for, and then we would check them off when we're done. And it worked great for a while. We were getting all of our stuff done. And, I would do my chores. Emily would do her chores. We'd check stuff off, and the house would stay squeaky clean. And every now and then, I would come to the chore list to see what I had to do. And I would not only find that Emily had done and checked off her chores, but she'd actually gone beyond the requirements of the chore chart, and she'd done and checked off some of mine too, just to say that she loves me. See? She's the best. Well, the chore chart limits, love lavishes. Like when it comes to following God, right? Well, the law limits, love lavishes. Recently, I heard a powerful story about the life of a man named Daryl Davis, who shared about why, as a black man, he attended the rallies of a group in the U.S. that is known for their beliefs of racial supremacy and discrimination. Daryl shared that when he was a young boy of 10, he remembered experiencing his first deliberate acts of racial hatred that prompted his parents to sit him down and explain racism. In Daryl's words, I had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. It was inconceivable to me that somebody who'd never laid eyes on me, had never spoken to me, knew absolutely nothing about me, would want to inflict pain upon me for no other reason than my skin. So I didn't believe my parents, but more and more incidents kept on happening, and I realized my parents were telling the truth. So at the age of 10, a question formed in my mind. How can you hate me when you don't even know me? So through his teen years, Daryl began reading as much as he could on the topic of discrimination. And by the time he became an adult, he realized, who better to ask this question to than someone who would join an organization that believed in prejudging and hating people without knowing anything about them? This led Daryl to setting up a meeting with a man named Roger Kelly, who at the time was a state-level leader of one of these organizations, just to get the answer to his question. And what followed was a tense first meeting, where Daryl recalls a civil discussion, where they agreed on some things, they disagreed on other things. And that's also where Daryl came to this realization. Ignorance breeds fear. Fear breeds hatred, and hatred breeds destruction. And what did Daryl decide to do after this meeting? He decided to extend friendship and keep in contact with Roger. So Daryl and Roger, they met often in the years that followed. Eventually, Roger would come and see Daryl's band, and Daryl would come to Roger's rallies, even joining him backstage for a soda after the rally. Now, then they began going to each other's house for dinner, and somewhere along the way, they became true friends. And as unexpected and as unlikely as their friendship seemed, what Roger did next was more so. Roger Kelly, a lifelong member and now national level leader in his organization, renounced his beliefs, and he cut ties with his organization. But why? The love of a friend. And you know what else is wild? Daryl didn't just have this happen with Roger. He also befriended and de-radicalized 200 other members of the same organization. And Daryl's story is amazing. And I highly recommend that you go to YouTube after this service and type in Daryl Davis TED Talk, because your heart will just explode in the best way. Here's something that struck me, though, is that culturally speaking, Daryl had every right to take the old eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth approach and return the hate to these men who spent their time running racial hate groups. Nobody would have blamed him. It makes sense, right? But Daryl chose a different path. He chose to give up his cultural right to harbor hatred. He chose to go beyond simply tolerating their existence, and he extended friendship and love. He went the extra mile. While the law limits, love lavishes. And love has the power to bring change. And I believe there is nowhere else that we see and experience this truth more than in the life of Jesus. Who during his life, Jesus taught that loving others out of our love for God was the purpose and the fulfillment of the law. But he didn't just say it, he embodied it, and he proved it. In the book of Luke, we read about how out of his love for God, out of his love for the Father, Jesus extended love to people, even those who were assigned to execute him. On the day that Jesus was crucified, we read that when they came to the place called the skull, that's where they were going to crucify Jesus. It says they nailed him to the cross, and Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing." So even in the midst of others committing cruelty, committing disrespect and murder against him, Jesus chose love. And his love was so great that he chose to give up his life on the cross so that all of humanity, so that you, so that me could have the opportunity to live in freedom from sin and experience the fullness of life in relationship with God, which is incredible because even though God he would have been completely within his rights to walk away from humanity, to just leave us to destroy ourselves, he chose to go the extra mile. He chose to take on the cross, to die the death that humanity deserved so that he could rise again, defeat death, and offer us life. On the cross, Jesus chose to let go of his rights, to go beyond his obligations in order to show honor and love to you and to me. While the law limits, love lavishes. And while love has the power to bring change, love infused with the purpose and with the presence of God's Spirit has the power to bring life. So I don't know where you're at in your relationship with Jesus this morning, but something that I believe is that going the extra mile is an invitation. It's an invitation from Jesus, the God that goes the extra mile. It's an invitation for us to let go of everything that stands in the way of a relationship with him, to welcome his Spirit to reshape our hearts and our lives so we can follow him, so we can unleash his love on this world, and together as a community with him go the extra mile for our world. And so if you want that to be true in your life, if you want to receive God's Spirit into your heart, if you've never done that, I'm going to pray in a minute, and I just invite you to pray with me, to be open to what we're asking, and I encourage you to reach out too. We got some awesome hosts in the chat, and if you have any questions or you make any decisions to follow Jesus this morning, I really encourage you to connect with them because we would love to help you see what the next steps are. So if you'd like to pray with me, let's do that now. So God, we just want to thank you for all that you've done for us as we reflect on what you did on the cross, what you did in your life, how you died and rose for us, Jesus. I ask that you would just help us to be open to you. Help us to receive your love. In all the areas of our lives that we think we're not lovable, God, you love us. So help us to receive that. And I also ask you to help show us anything that's holding us back, and help us to just turn that over to you and show us how we can lavish love on all those around us. God, we thank you so much for the opportunity to have a relationship with you, to have life, and to partner with you to go the extra mile in this world. So we love you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.